How did silver coins minted in the cities of Persia end up buried in frozen soil thousands of miles away in Scandinavia, carried there by people we still casually describe as raiders from the edge of Europe? Archaeologists have uncovered Abbasid dirhams in Viking graves across Sweden, Norway, and the Baltic coast in numbers so large that they cannot be explained as the scattered spoils of occasional plunder. Entire hordes appear in fields that once held small farms, sometimes hundreds of coins together, struck in Baghdad, Samarkand, or Nishapur. The paradox is uncomfortable because it suggests something that does not fit the image many of us inherited. If Vikings were merely opportunistic raiders moving along the coasts of Western Europe, how did their silver economy become so deeply tied to the heart of the Islamic world? The distance between these regions is not only geographic, but environmental, cultural, and political. Yet the evidence lies quietly in the ground, waiting for explanation. Somewhere between the forests of Scandinavia and the markets of Persia, a system existed that connected them. And if such a system existed, then the Viking Age may not have been defined primarily by violence at all, but by something far less dramatic and far more difficult to recognize: the quiet construction of a survival network stretching across half a continent. A common assumption holds that Vikings reached wealth primarily through raids on monasteries and coastal towns in Western Europe. The narrative is familiar because it is visually dramatic, and because written sources from the victims survived. But archaeology tends to expose the limits of stories preserved in manuscripts. When researchers began cataloging silver coins found across Viking settlements, a striking pattern emerged. The overwhelming majority were not Western European at all. They were Islamic dirhams, minted under the Abbasid Caliphate. These coins arrived in Scandinavia not as occasional curiosities, but in enormous quantities. Some Swedish sites contain thousands. If these coins had come through raiding, we would expect them to appear primarily near coastal war zones. Instead, they appear deep inland along ancient river systems. The implication is subtle but profound. Rather than ships striking monasteries and returning home, large numbers of Vikings were moving eastward through a different landscape entirely. They were traveling along rivers that carried them through the forests of Eastern Europe toward the trading cities of the Islamic world. The Viking economy, it turns out, may have been oriented less toward sudden violence and more toward long-distance exchange. Another assumption suggests that Viking ships were designed only for the open ocean, built for sudden raids along distant coasts, rather than quiet travel deep within a continent. The familiar image of the longship cutting through Atlantic waves often overshadows a quieter reality. The geography of Eastern Europe presented a very different environment. Between Scandinavia and the Caspian Sea stretches a vast network of rivers that once formed natural corridors across the continent. The Dnieper flows toward the Black Sea, the Don bends through the steppe, and the Volga reaches deep into the interior of Eurasia. Together, these waterways linked forests, grasslands, and distant trading worlds. Viking ships were remarkably suited to this landscape. Their shallow draft allowed them to move through rivers where heavier vessels could not pass. Their clinker-built hulls were both flexible and strong. Most importantly, they were light enough for crews to drag across narrow strips of land when rivers no longer connected. Archaeological reconstructions show that these portages turned separate river systems into a continuous route. Seen this way, the distance between Scandinavia and Persia becomes less improbable. What appears today as a continental barrier may once have unfolded as a chain of rivers joined by short overland passages. The journey was slow and demanding, shaped by geography rather than conquest. Many modern interpretations still assume that trade followed warfare, as though exchange began only after territories were subdued. Yet in the Viking world, the sequence may have worked in the opposite direction. Communities in Scandinavia lived within narrow environmental limits. Long winters and thin soils restricted agricultural production, while growing populations placed quiet pressure on already fragile landscapes. Under these conditions, survival often depended on access to resources that local environments could not easily provide. Silver became one of those resources. In much of the Viking world, coinage held little formal authority, yet silver itself carried value that could move across cultures. Abbasid dirhams, arriving along eastern trade routes, were rarely used as intact coins. They were frequently cut into fragments and weighed on small balance scales, functioning more like pieces of bullion than currency. This practice reveals an economy shaped by measurement, rather than by the authority of the mint. Traders moving along the Volga were not simply collecting foreign coins. They were integrating silver into a flexible system of exchange that could operate across very different political worlds. The scattered hoards discovered today may represent stored value in societies that understood wealth as something portable and divisible, a practical strategy for communities living close to the edge of agricultural stability. The presence of Vikings along the Volga might at first suggest the advance of an organized northern empire, pushing steadily into new territory. Yet the historical record points toward a far more fragmented reality. Arabic chroniclers writing in the 10th century described encounters with traders from the distant north who arrived along the river routes, carrying goods gathered from forests far beyond the borders of the Abbasid world. Among the most detailed of these observers was the diplomat Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who recorded the arrival of Scandinavian merchants among the trading settlements of the Volga basin. What he described did not resemble an invading force. These travelers did not appear as representatives of a centralized power or as organized armies seeking conquest. They appeared instead as merchants, moving within systems of exchange that already existed among Slavic communities and the nomadic societies of the steppe. In many ways, the Vikings were newcomers, adapting themselves to networks that predated their arrival by generations. Long before Scandinavian ships entered these rivers, the Volga corridor had already linked fur-rich northern forests with the markets of Central Asia and Persia. What the Vikings added was not the invention of trade itself. Their contribution lay in mobility. Their ships, their navigational experience, and their ability to endure long seasonal journeys allowed them to move between ecological worlds with unusual efficiency. In doing so, they became intermediaries within a system that was already alive, connecting distant landscapes through patience rather than conquest. Modern observers sometimes imagine Viking expansion as the result of ambition or an endless appetite for wealth. Yet the landscapes of Scandinavia suggest a quieter and more practical explanation. Northern Europe offered only narrow margins for agriculture. The growing season was short, the winters long and unpredictable. Thin soils across much of Norway and Sweden limited the amount of grain that could be harvested in any given year. As populations slowly increased, the pressure on these fragile landscapes became more difficult to ignore. In such conditions, trade begins to look less like opportunity and more like strategy. Communities living near the edge of agricultural stability could not rely entirely on local harvests. They needed access to resources that existed beyond their immediate environment. Goods gathered from northern ecosystems became valuable in distant markets. Furs from deep forests, amber from Baltic shores, and walrus ivory from Arctic waters could travel south along the river routes. Even captives taken from frontier regions sometimes entered these networks, reflecting the harsh realities of early medieval economies. In return, silver and luxury goods from the Islamic world flowed northward. These exchanges were not simply transactions. They were adaptations to environmental limits. Communities that connected themselves to long-distance trade gained a measure of resilience. Those that remained isolated were far more vulnerable when harvests failed or winters grew longer. Seen in this light, the Viking presence along the Volga begins to look less like expansion and more like a practical response to the ecological boundaries of their homeland. It is tempting to imagine the Viking trader as a solitary adventurer crossing half a continent, a figure moving alone through forests and rivers in search of distant markets. The romantic image is powerful, but the archaeological record suggests something far more organized and collective. Excavations along the Volga and its tributaries reveal settlements that were anything but isolated outposts. These river towns formed small but active crossroads where cultures met. Scandinavian objects appear beside Slavic pottery, Turkic ornaments, and goods from the Islamic world. The material record suggests communities where languages mixed and customs quietly overlapped. For travelers moving through this landscape, the journey was rarely continuous. Rivers froze in winter and flooded in spring. Crews often had to wait months for ice to break or for water levels to rise enough to carry their ships forward. These waiting places became seasonal settlements where merchants repaired vessels, traded information, and negotiated alliances. The rhythm of trade was therefore patient and cyclical. Ships leaving Scandinavia in the spring might not return until the following year. Time itself became part of the system. What sustained this network was not speed, but reliability. Knowledge of safe routes, political boundaries, and seasonal dangers passed from one generation to the next. These were not instructions written on maps, but skills carried in memory and practice, preserved by communities who understood that survival depended on remembering the path. The silver dirhams themselves reveal another layer of complexity within this story. When archaeologists examine the coins found in Scandinavian hoards, they often discover that many were minted decades before they were finally buried in northern soil. Some coins are worn nearly smooth from years of circulation. Edges are softened by countless exchanges, and inscriptions are sometimes barely visible after long use in distant markets. These details tell us something important about the movement of wealth across Eurasia. Silver did not travel in a single direct journey from Persia to Scandinavia. Instead, it moved slowly through a chain of exchanges. Coins passed through merchant caravans crossing the steppe, through trading communities along river systems, and through urban markets where goods from many regions met. Each exchange added time to the journey. Each market became another link in a long economic chain stretching across continents. In this sense, the dirhams found in Viking hoards represent more than contact with the Islamic world. They are artifacts of a far larger network that connected distant societies long before the modern idea of globalization existed. By the time these coins reached Scandinavia, they had already moved through many hands and many landscapes. Within their worn surfaces, they carried the quiet imprint of countless traders whose names history never recorded. One final misconception still lingers in popular imagination. Viking contact with the Islamic world is often assumed to have been rare, accidental, or the result of a few extraordinary journeys. The archaeological record suggests something very different. Across Scandinavia, thousands of Abbasid dirhams have been recovered from hoards, settlements, and burial sites. The scale of these discoveries points not to isolated encounters, but to sustained interaction that lasted for generations. Silver moved north in such quantities that it reshaped entire regional economies. The Volga route therefore functioned less like a daring expedition and more like a corridor maintained through repeated movement. Ships traveled south along familiar rivers year after year, following paths that had gradually become reliable. Its success depended on cooperation with the communities who lived along these landscapes. Slavic farmers understood the river valleys and forest routes. Steppe nomads knew the seasonal rhythms of the grasslands. Muslim merchants connected these distant frontiers to the markets of Central Asia and Persia. Each group contributed knowledge that outsiders alone could not possess. Without guides through forest rivers, without winter camps along the steppe, without trading cities willing to exchange silver for northern goods, the route could never have endured. Within this system, the Vikings were not dominant conquerors. They were participants. They became one thread within a network far larger than themselves, woven together by geography, patience, and shared necessity. In the end, the silver buried beneath Scandinavian fields does not simply tell a story about Vikings reaching Persia. It reveals something quieter about the nature of human survival. Across vast distances and unfamiliar cultures, people found ways to exchange what they had for what they needed. Rivers carried ships, but they also carried ideas about cooperation, risk, and adaptation. The men who guided boats along the Volga could not have imagined that their journeys would still be traced 1,000 years later through fragments of silver in the earth. Yet those fragments remind us that history often moves not through conquest alone, but through the slow weaving of connections between distant lives. If stories like this resonate with you, perhaps because your own family once moved across landscapes in search of work or stability, you may recognize the quiet pattern beneath them. Generations before us crossed rivers, mountains, and oceans, not to change the world, but simply to endure within it. And sometimes the only evidence they left behind was a small piece of silver, waiting patiently beneath the soil.